Alright, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the 411 Ground and Pound MMA podcast, your weekly look into the wide, wacky, wonderful world of mixed martial arts. I'm Robert Winfrey, and I'm your host. Heads up, I'll be flying solo this evening, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. So thank you all very much. And also, just a heads up, it's just me this time around. So, Jeff should be back, I think, next week, but, life is life. It's a tricky business. And no one comes out of it alive. On the docket this evening, we have a review of last night, UFC on ESPN Plus 27, and boy was that a dog of a card. But, oh, so much hilarity. Especially if you're like me and don't mind watching the world burn a little bit. Next week, we have UFC 248, this week. So there will be a preview of that, and that is a heck of a card. Very much looking forward to that. And news of the week. Not a lot of news, so we'll go over news such as there is. And again, since this is just me, let's go ahead and jump into the review portion. Shouldn't be too long here. UFC on ESPN Plus 27. Last week, both Jeff and I picked Joseph Benavidez. I said I wanted a draw to come out of this fight because that would be the funniest thing. I, for some reason, did not consider the potentially even the better bit of hilarity. Deiveson Figueiredo missed weight for this fight. He weighed officially 127.5, which is a pretty big miss. That's 2.5 pounds over the title limit, so not a good look. First time he's ever missed weight, and, everyone kind of gets one, but if your one is, hey, a title fight, yeah, not a good look. Had I genuinely considered, okay, what if one of them misses weight? I'd want the guy who missed weight to win. I'd almost rather it was kind of a BS win too, like a cut after losing the fight for the majority of it. So we didn't quite get that. However, Deiveson Figueiredo does TKO Joseph Benavidez at 154 of the second round. I don't know what to tell you guys. The fight, such as it was a pretty good fight. I think it was the only real fight on the card you could kind of look forward to in that respect. And Figueiredo had some pretty good counters lined up for Benavidez. He had a good counter right that he was finding pretty consistently. Benavidez, for his part, nearly got armbarred in the first round, but Benavidez is a scrambling god. He was pushing a decent pace, and Figueiredo's gas tank is a little bit questionable. I expected more grappling out of Benavidez, to be quite honest. Instead, he did a lot of the same kind of shifting punches he's been doing recently. A lot of the same leading with his face. And that played into the finish. He tries another one of those lunging, shifting punches. They clash heads because Figueiredo has appropriately studied the Benavidez versus Henry Cejudo fight, where anytime Benavidez was like, hey, I'm going to lunge in on you, Cejudo's response wasn't get out of the way. It was plant my feet, duck my head down, and let your head run into the top of mine. Which is technically against the rules, but since no one in MMA calls it, everyone should be doing it. After that, again, Figueiredo just kind of circled him to the fence. That clash of heads opened up a pretty nasty cut. Got him circling on the fence, split his both guard and timing with a really nice straight right. And Figueiredo has power, sat him down, finished it. Figueiredo now wins, but is not the champion because he missed weight. And I fully expect the UFC to essentially dissolve this division in the next 6 months. I'm very tempted to actually write out a piece about the flyweight division in the UFC because it almost needs to be looked at, the entire thing from start to finish. It's so bizarre in so many ways. I'm a little surprised the UFC didn't decide to just acknowledge Figueiredo as champion anyway. For those of you who might be screaming at me right now, but he missed weight. Yes, he did. Here's the catch. If you'll remember, when Al Iaquinta missed the title weight for UFC, his fight with Khabib. Oh, what was that? I can't remember off the top of my head. I have to look it up now. That was 18, I think. That would have been late 19. Excuse me, late 17. 223. That was it. Iaquinta did not actually weigh 155 for that fight. He was initially going to fight somebody else, and he weighed 156, 155 point something or other. However, here's kind of the rub about this. The UFC said if he won, they were going to recognize him as their champion, which they can do. Now, the champion would not be acknowledged, if that was Iaquinta in that case, would not be acknowledged by the sanctioning body, the New York State Athletic Commission, again, if we're talking about that one specifically. But the reality is the UFC doesn't need their champions to be recognized by the commissions necessarily, because they're not commission titles. These fights aren't for the champion of the state or even the world. It's for the champion of the UFC. So if the UFC wanted to go with this and go, you know what, screw it, this will be for the title anyway, they could have. And because this event took place in Virginia, they had a long name for their body, like the Virginia Licensing and Combative Sports Division, or whatever the heck they called it, would not recognize Figueiredo as the flyweight champion. However, the UFC's response to this could very reasonably be, this is not about whether or not Virginia recognizes him as the champion, but whether or not we recognize him as the champion. The value in having the individual sanctioning bodies recognize your title is that it adds legitimacy. If the UFC wanted to just point at a ham sandwich and go, congratulations, you're now the champion of whatever, they could. There's nothing legally, contractually stopping them from doing so. They tend to play within the rules because they don't want to rock the boat too much with both the sanctioning bodies and the fighters. I think everyone would have given them a pass on the Iaquinta situation because of the totality of circumstance. Being very, very last minute with, hey, all of a sudden you're in the title, and you only weighed, a fifth of a pound over the limit anyway. If you'd known you were fighting for the belt, you probably could have cut that kind of thing. I think there would have been a degree of leniency given by the fighters, by the fan base, etc. If you're in a circumstance like this, there's going to be some outrage, and deserving outrage. But the UFC still could have done it. I don't really think there's anything stopping them from doing so other than they don't want to. But if they wanted to come out of this and go, yeah, sure, we'll make Deiveson Figueiredo the champion, even though he missed weight, because we don't need Virginia to recognize him as champion. We just need to recognize him as champion. For the record, they are correct. Again, like legally, I believe that's correct. Anyone who knows more, feel free to let me know. But if that's what they wanted to do, they could absolutely do that. Now, they don't. They don't want to. Fighters have taken an inordinate amount of abuse from the UFC. I think there's a degree of, I hate to say hesitance about this on the UFC's part, but they really don't want to, they're kind of always pushing fighters back. And eventually they're going to push them up against a wall or over a line they're not willing to cross, and then there's going to be serious pushback that the UFC doesn't want to deal with. They haven't found that point yet, which is crazy considering the UFC unilaterally, removes their ability to have sponsors, forces them to wear dull, generic Reebok gear, pays them a pittance as far as that goes, tries to factor in the cost of USADA with their fighter compensation totals. unilaterally forces a new drug testing policy on them, completely devoid of fighter input. And the fighters have largely just taken all of this. Eventually, there's going to be something where, that's all I can stand, I can't stand no more. And the UFC just doesn't want to find that point until they absolutely have to. And I think if they started, rewarding title shots like that when there's no mitigating circumstances, this wasn't a late notice replacement, this fight wasn't moved around for a long time, this fight has been set for this date, Figueiredo just blew it. That might be the line, and I don't think they're really looking to cross that, but I also think that they might be, if we're talking about a different division, which again changes a lot of the mechanics, but if we're talking about a different division, they might be willing to go through some of those hoops if it meant, ensuring the continuity of the division. Since they don't actually care about flyweight, they're not going to go through any extraordinary measures. Or in some cases, even ordinary measures. As for what's next, I don't know. I know some of the broadcast team are like, hey, let's do an immediate rematch. It's a tough sell when you get stopped that cleanly in the second round. Again, there is the weight issue, and maybe if he'd actually cut down to the weight, he'd be more drained, and Benavidez could have won, and I don't know. There's some talk, and I know Henry Cejudo decided, hey, I'll come back down to flyweight fight again. No, you're not. Just stop. You're not going to do that. He might make more noise about that if Jose Aldo beats him, which might happen. More on that fight a little bit later. But I really don't see it. The UFC has been quietly dismantling this division for the last 2 years. I mean, even before, I think if you look at 2018, they were releasing a lot of top-level flyweights because they didn't like them, because they wanted to try and open up the rest of the division. I don't know. I mean, just in all seriousness, think about this. Is there any other division that the UFC hosts that you can say 3 of the 5 best fighters in that division are not in the UFC? Not to say that there aren't top fighters in any weight class outside of the UFC. There are. If we're talking welterweight, Douglas Lima. Great fighter. He's Bellator's welterweight champion. I think he'd do very, very well in the UFC. If we go up to something like light heavyweight or heavyweight, I mean, much I joke about him, Ryan Bader's probably he'd be a top 5 guy in the UFC if he came back at light heavyweight. He'd be pretty close if not. He'd be real close if not. So, again, there are certainly examples of top shelf talent in every division outside the UFC. But is Douglas Lima one of the 3 or 5 best welterweights in the world? He might be, but do you think there's another one out there besides Douglas Lima? So you got Lima, so you got one of maybe the 5 best welterweights in the world, not in the UFC. You think there's another one? Or 2? I can't think of another 2 guys off the top of my head at 170 that I think are... That guy's one of the best in the entire world, not in the UFC. I can't really do that at heavyweight, which is the only other division I think you could reasonably do that. Because heavyweight's it's heavyweight. I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, again, look at light heavyweight. Let's just go down the list here. You could argue Bader would be, top 5 205er in the world. And I think that's probably about accurate. Can you name another one? Because, I mean, you want to say Phil Davis? I don't. I don't think Phil Davis against any of the top 5 guys in the UFC has much of a chance. Might be wrong there. Again, there's a lot of talent in Phil Davis, but are we really going to try and pretend that that guy's giving the top of that division a real run for their money? Probably not. Brandon Vera, I think, was the 205-pound champion and won. I don't know if he still is or not. I think he lost one of his belts, but he was 205. He was light heavyweight and heavyweight. And Brandon Vera in 2020, really? We're gonna pretend he's not. He's just not. So again, you get one, maybe. And if Bader's not top 5, he is, in fairness to him, definitely top 10. Middleweight. I know Bellator has a couple of decent guys. You've got, Mousasi floating around out there. He's in Bellator. But outside of, maybe Machida. Machida top 5? In 2020, is Lyoto Machida top 5 middleweight in the world? No, probably not. Probably not. Welterweight again, we said 1. Lightweight, okay. Lightweight just being as absurdly deep as it is, maybe you could make the argument there. I still think if we're talking lightweight, maybe Eddie Alvarez. Maybe. And then, depending on whether or not you want to say Patricio Pitbull is lightweight or featherweight. He's definitely, if we're talking featherweight, he's definitely like top 5. But again, you got 1. You don't really have 3 or 4. If we go all the way down, if we look at flyweight, there's a very real argument that the 3 best flyweight fighters in the world are not in the UFC's flyweight division. You have Henry Cejudo, who's not in the division. Demetrius Johnson, not in the company anymore. Kyoji Horiguchi, not in the company anymore. There's just no real investment there. So, I imagine we're going to see that division folded probably quietly. Like, they'll wait a few weeks, let a few more events play out, and then just kind of quietly, we're not going to rebook that. We're just going to let that sit for a while. Which sucks in a lot of ways because I like flyweights, but I'm also not going to put my head in the sand about how the market has responded. And there's plenty of blame to go around all parties on this. There's how the UFC tried to build it, which was not very well. There were some X factors that kind of played their hand. There was, Demetrius Johnson being essentially unbeatable in the cage, but never really connecting with the audience. And where do you place the blame on that? Little's on DJ, little's on the UFC, little's on the market just being stubborn. Okay. Again, a little of all 3. And then you'd also just kind of get the UFC again shedding the division, like releasing a bunch of top shelf guys and a bunch of prospects. So I imagine that's what we're going to see happen. Sucks for those guys, really does. But I'm not going to pretend I can't understand the UFC's kind of thinking here. Anyway, that was your main event. Pretty good fight, actually, for as long as it lasted. Moving on, your co-main event. Felicia Spencer defeated Zara Farron via TKO, punches and elbows, 3:37 of the first. It was a women's featherweight fight. I don't know. It wasn't. Felicia Spencer's a good grappler. She's got good lead leg dexterity. Not a great puncher. Again, solid grappler. Pretty decent passing game, but her 3 fights in the UFC have been against Megan Anderson, her grappling has been coming along. Was not in a really good place ahead of that fight. She got bludgeoned by Cyborg for 3 rounds. And then here beats Zara Farron, who probably shouldn't be in the UFC. I don't know what to tell you. There were 2 women's featherweight fights on this main card. They were holding kind of unofficial auditions for UFC 250. Amanda Nunes wants to be on that card, and she's made some noise about wanting to defend the featherweight belt. Which that would give her history. She'd be the first double champion, simultaneous double champion, to successfully defend both of her titles while holding them. Again, that's getting a little noodly as far as firsts go, but that's still kind of an important one. I mean, the only dual champion to actually defend both of their titles at all to this point was Daniel Cormier, who had notched heavyweight and light heavyweight title defenses. Cormier never defended the light heavyweight belt after he won the heavyweight belt. And Cejudo has not had a chance yet to defend the bantamweight title at all. He did have the one successful flyweight title defense, but now he's no longer a dual champion, so there's also that to consider. But Nunes, since winning both belts, has defended the bantamweight title, I think, twice. And now could, become the first dual champion to defend both belts while holding both belts. That's a very difficult thing to do. The fact that women's featherweight is not actually a division certainly helps. So anyway, Spencer's kind of making her case for, hey, I want that shot at Amanda Nunes at UFC 250. I do not give her much of a chance against Nunes, but that is a universal truth. Magomed Ankalaev defeated Iwan Kutelaba via TKO 38 seconds into the first round. Bad stoppage in this fight. Ankalaev comes out. He kind of clips Kutelaba behind the ear, starts firing some head kicks that are mostly blocked, but every time he lands, Kutelaba's moving, and Kutelaba starts looking a little bit wobbly. His equilibrium doesn't quite seem there. How much of that was, hey, I just got punched behind the ear, and how much of that was him trying to act more hurt than he was, to goad Ankalaev into a crazy... is a little bit unclear. In real time, you can kind of see how this stoppage materialized. That doesn't make it a good stoppage. This wasn't a very good stoppage. They might run it back. I mean, this fight probably shouldn't have happened just because when Bruce Buffer was doing the fighter announcements, Kutelaba, as he kind of normally does, walked all the way across the cage, got in the other guy's face. He got chest to chest with Ankalaev, who immediately grabbed double underhooks and just kind of slung him off to the side. You're really not supposed to touch before the fight starts. If you do, the commission could just, nope, that's it, fight's off. It's a violation of the rules. Somewhat ironically, as was pointed out, had they invoked that bit of the rules, it would have made more sense than the way the actual stoppage played out in some ways. So the UFC might just run it back. Ankalaev was kind of handling him anyway. I expect if they do just rebook it, he'll do the same. Kutelaba's a wild man and provides occasionally entertaining fights, but he's not really ever going to be, that guy. So there was that. Alright, next up we had the other women's featherweight fight on this main card. Megan Anderson defeated Norma Dumont via knockout, 3:31 of the first. Megan Anderson's had a rough go of it in the UFC, but here she kind of finally looks like she's putting all the things together. She avoided some takedowns, was able to clinch break. Took her longer than you'd like to see, but did eventually break the clinch that she'd been stuck in. Just a really nice finishing punch, too. She steps forward, steps a little bit off to her own left, dips her head to avoid a right from Dumont, and cracks her with a counter. Anderson also says she wants to fight Nunes. I think purely based on styles, Anderson might have at least an outside puncher's chance against Nunes. I don't even give Felicia Spencer that. That's it. I don't think either woman is beating Amanda Nunes. And kicking off the main card, Grant Dawson defeated Derek Minner via rear naked choke, 1:38 of the second. Grant Dawson missed weight for this fight. He weighed 149.5. It's a bad miss. That's 4.5 pounds. I mean, 3.5 if you want to give him the 146 for non-title. That's a big miss. That said, he survived some pretty close guillotine attempts in the first. Just kept a good pace, kept good pressure. Dawson's a fairly legitimate prospect for the division, as things currently stand, assuming he's even going to stay in that division after that big a miss. Minner took the fight on short notice, so I think he's normally a bantamweight. So maybe a few, and he looked aggressive for the time that he had. So credit to him. Decent enough little fight. And as for the prelims, Kyler Phillips defeated Gabriel Silva via unanimous decision, 30-27 across the boards. This was your fight of the night. This was a good fight. These two came to scrap. Phillips just had a greater diversity of offense, both on the feet and on the ground, just constantly, even when moving backwards, finding ways to tag Silva, hurt him a couple of times. If you're going to look up a fight from this card that isn't the main event, this is the one to look up. Good fight. At middleweight, Brendan Allen defeated Tom Breeze via TKO, 4:47 of the first. Yeah, I've been around long enough to remember when Tom Breeze was going to be a thing. Yeah, long time ago. Allen looks like a fairly decent prospect for middleweight, though, so good for him. Marcin Tybura defeated Sergey Spivak via unanimous decision, 2:30-27, 129-28. This fight sucked. Luis Pena defeated Steve Garcia via unanimous decision, 30-27 across the boards. Pena was the superior grappler. They got into a few wild striking exchanges, and then Pena took him down, got his back, but couldn't finish. Rinse and repeat all 3 rounds. Pena apologized after, like, that's not how I normally fight. Buddy, I've seen all your UFC fights. That's kind of how you fight. I don't know what your vision of yourself is, but it does not mesh with reality. This fight was very representative of how you have conducted yourself in the cage during your UFC run. And in all fairness, you've won more than you've lost, I think. So, I don't know. I would not be apologizing for that. Jordan Griffin defeated TJ Brown via technical submission, guillotine choke, 3:38 of the second. TJ Brown was putting a beating on Jordan Griffin. Griffin kept selling out for guillotine chokes. He finally caught one. Brown moved to side control on the safe side, but something about the arm position and the grip that Griffin was using meant that he wasn't actually safe, and a little bit later just went to sleep. That's a rarity. You can actually finish that choke from that side, from that position, but Griffin did it, so credit to him. This was his first UFC win. It broke like a 2 or 3 fight losing streak, so I still don't see him having a lot of sustained success in the UFC. But, hey, he got a win, so you know what? Good for him. In your upset of the... Well, there were several upsets. In your reminder that having a spectacular finish on Dana White's Contender Series does not necessarily translating to success in the UFC, the reminder of that, Spike Carlyle defeated Alon Cruz via TKO, elbow, and punches, 125 of the first. Carlyle caught Cruz. He caught him with a bit of a head kick early, and Cruz decided to clinch up and try to grapple. Carlyle, with his back to the fence, hits this really nice elbow. It's not quite 12-6, more 11-5. And it comes down, and he finds a really, really, really nice spot for it on the head of Cruz. It's a little bit like on the temple, kind of behind the ear. It got close to being illegal, but was a legal blow. Sounded really nasty, badly rocks him. Cruz kind of drops, winds up pulling Carlyle into mount. Carlyle unloads. That's all she wrote. Really, really solid debut from Carlyle, who seems to have some pretty significant power for a featherweight. And kicking off the main card, probably on paper, the second best fight on this card, Sean Brady defeated Ismail Narudia via unanimous decision, 229-28, 130-27. Did not agree with the 30-27. Brady, just in the second and third, was able to force grappling exchanges that Narudiev didn't like. Once Brady got his back, he was just riding him, would not be dissuaded, would not be unstuck. I wouldn't say full-on, Khabib-esque. Not that much damage inflicted, but the same principles. Once I get to you, once my hands get locked together, you're going to have a devil of a time actually getting me off. I'm going to ride you up and down. I'm going to hit you with mat returns. I'm going to pepper you with shots when I can. Just that. constantly through rounds 2 and 3. So, I mean, solid win for Brady, who's still undefeated, now 2-0 in the UFC. Nurudiev, unfortunately, seems to be... he needs a pivot. He needs some kind of alteration to what he's currently doing because it's not really working. I think he's now 2-2 in the UFC. And the grappling deficiency at this level is becoming a pretty severe liability for him. So that was UFC on ESPN Plus 27. It was a dog of a card on paper and not a great event. I mean, everything on the main card ended in a finish, but please do not let this confuse you into thinking that finishes equal good or exciting fights, whereas decisions equal boring fights. Again, Minner and Dawson was a pretty good fight. Figueiredo and Benavidez was pretty good. Spencer and Farron was meh. Anderson and Dumont was meh outside of the finish. And on Ankalaev and Kutalaba, I think I said it in the preview for this, like, that's going to be crazy, but not necessarily crazy in the good way. And I was correct there. So, and if we get into the prelims, again, Phillips and Silva, great fight. And most of the rest of it, again, if you want to really pick and choose, Carlisle and Cruz was a decent enough finish. Pena and Garcia didn't do anything for me. Tabor and Spivak sucked. Brady and Nurudiev, not bad, but I don't know why you'd go out of your way to find it if you didn't see it live. No one cared about this event. This did, I think, just smaller traffic, smaller numbers. Not a lot of people commented. I think one of the people who did comment said this fight was taking place, very close to where they live, but they weren't even going to be bothered to look up ticket prices. I feel you guys. I really do. I think there's a joke that Jack Slack had made, where I think in the middle / coming to the back end of 8 weeks in a row of fights. But of those 8 events, only 3 of them are any good. So, it happens. And it's especially likely to happen in slightly smaller markets. And, look, I say that as a guy whose state has had a grand total of 1 UFC event during the promotion's entire existence. And the main event to that card was Alex Caceres and Yair Rodriguez. Look, we got the finger, okay? I mean, freaking Boise got Junior Dos Santos. They got former heavyweight champion JDS. Us, we get 2 kings of useless spinning attacks. I'm just a little bitter. I mean, that being said, the event in, Rio Rancho a couple of weeks ago was not great either. If you exist within driving distance of a major market, like Vegas, New York, Boston, Los Angeles, the UFC is only going to come to you intermittently, and they're not going to bring their A material. They're just not. It sucks, but not really anything that can be done about that, I guess, so, But what's the purpose of having a podcast if I can't complain about that every now and then? Alright, moving on from bad cards. Next, this coming Saturday, UFC 248. Ooh, boy. Let's talk about this one. This is a great card. This is a legitimately great card. The main event, which I cannot wait for, Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero. Adesanya's middleweight championship will be on the line. This is his first defense of the undisputed title. Look, in a perfect world, Adesanya's first title defense is not against Yoel Romero. Let's get that out of the way. It should be... Realistically, it should be Paulo Costa. Costa just beat Romero. He's undefeated in the UFC. I think undefeated overall. He and Adesanya were making noise at each other. That was kind of the fight to make. Adesanya got it... Or not Adesanya. Costa's out, injured. If you're a conspiracy theorist, then you might say he's cycling off of something. And, I mean, it's MMA. Like, if you want to be that level of conspiracy theorist, there's plenty of evidence to support you in some cases. Um, that again, not available. If it wasn't Costa, it probably should have been Jared Cannonier. That said, several weeks before they announced Adesanya and Romero, the UFC had announced Cannonier and former champion Robert Whittaker for this event. Which is a good fight. It gives Whittaker, if Whittaker beats Cannonier, he might be back in the title picture. If Cannonier takes out Robert Whittaker, he's your number one contender. A sensible fight. That fell out. Robert Whittaker had to withdraw. So the UFC was going to have Cannonier be on standby for the main event. However, Cannonier, not too long ago, indicated that he suffered a pec or chest injury. And I don't think it's going to require surgery, but he's not available for this event. So the top two deserving contenders are out of the picture. This muddies the water a little bit. So who's the next most deserving? I think if you go by rankings, you have Whittaker in there. Whittaker just got finished by Adesanya cleanly, so he's out of the question. Kelvin Gastelum just lost to Darren Till. Darren Till's only got one win at middleweight. The reality is, as the chips have fallen, Romero's the best option. Not, again, in a perfect world, not the fight. We don't live in a perfect world, we live in this world. Consequently, this is the fight, and, I can live with it. I mean, I get that Romero's on a losing streak. I think if you're going to, say something in his favor, one, I thought he won the Whittaker fight. The second one, at a minimum draw instead of loss. I kind of thought he won the Paulo Costa fight. There's certainly an argument in his favor, even if you scored it for Costa. So, his only real, clear loss in the UFC, if you look at how the fight played out, okay, no, that guy won, is the first fight with Robert Whittaker. Their rematch against Split, I thought he won. At a bare minimum, I don't think you can score that fight for Robert Whittaker. I think it's either Romero or draw. My opinion. Costa fight, I thought he won, but I can see there's a very clear argument for either guy winning that fight, such is the nature of the 10-point must system. But you're dealing with a guy who, could very easily have come out on the winning end of his last couple of fights, and is the only guy standing if you want to have this kind of a title fight main eventing this card, and I think that's a big consideration. The UFC's schedule and just the content that they are mandated to put out is a giant consideration for how these things are put together. So if you're the UFC matchmaker and you're trying to put together UFC 248, there's two title fights here, the co-main event, Weili Zhang and Ioana Jędrzejczyk. You're not going to main event a pay-per-view with that. Most of the fan base probably didn't even see Zhang's title win, because it took place at 3 in the morning on an ESPN Plus card from China. Just not highly visible. And Ioana, despite her UFC tenure, never really... look, she's a great fighter. What I'm about to say is not a knock on her abilities at all. Great fighter. But for all of us who were kind of looking at her when she came up, when she won the belt, when she got a couple of defenses going, maybe there's something here to the point where she can genuinely become a big deal, like a star. She never did. I don't know I don't know why. Star making is an incredibly mercurial bit of alchemy. No one really knows, or they do it all the time. Point being, that fight's not really a big pay-per-view headliner, so you want another title fight to bolster it. So let's kind of go down the list of what titles we have potentially available. Heavyweight, not available. Stipe's out, still recovering from his eye injury. No heavyweight. Light heavyweight. John Jones fought very recently. Previous pay-per-view, light heavyweight belt was on the line. Not available. Middleweight. Middleweight fits the time frame, so let's just remember middleweight. Welterweight. You have the welterweight title penciled in right now for International Fight Week. So that's where you want to put that. Not available for this card. Lightweight. You have lightweight scheduled for April with Tony and Khabib. Not available. Featherweight. You want featherweight to be the main event probably of your Australia card. That's coming up in... Look up when that is, actually. Oh, do they not have a date for that yet? Oh, no, there it is. June. So 251. So featherweight set for June. And in all fairness, given when... I mean... it's not like the featherweight belt was defended very recently. Geez, what was it? It was near the end. It was 245. Yeah, so 4 months ago. That was so that's an unreasonable turnaround, and you want to have that in June in Australia. Probably the rematch between Volkanovski and Holloway. So featherweight's off the table. Bantamweight. You want bantamweight at bantamweight's going to be at 250. So bantamweight's not available. Flyweight just happened. Flyweight's not available. Women's bantamweight. Ditto the 250 thing. Women's featherweight, not a division. Women's strawweight, already on this card. And women's flyweight, Valentina fought not that long ago and already has her next fight scheduled. So really, if you're kind of planning this out, middleweight's the title that most makes sense to be on this card to support the women's strawweight title fight. And of the available participants, when you're putting this together, again, the cards have changed a lot. Even if they initially went with Costa, and then, nope, he's out, he's injured. All right, we went with Cannonier. Cannonier's injured. Cannonier would have had to pull out, again, just middle of February even. So you'd be talking about somebody having to step in on very short notice. And Whittaker, we don't know why Whittaker withdrew from his fight with Cannonier, but since it doesn't seem to be injury related, so let's just kind of assume that whatever caused him to pull out would have happened anyway. You'd be having to grab somebody on very short notice for that fight. So this kind of played out, I think, the best way it could have. As for the fight itself, this is a really, really good fight on paper. It's a very, very compelling fight. This is a very, very awkward clash of styles. Israel Adesanya is, I don't want to say flat on his feet, because he's not flat in the sense that he is sedentary. But if you watch the way he moves, he's not bouncy. He's not really up on his toes the way a lot of kickboxers or karate guys are. He is light and quick on his feet, but he is not bouncy. And that kind of targeting can be an issue for standing in front of someone like Yoel Romero, who has an incredible ability to explode through distance with a lot of power behind what he does. I mean, unless Romero catches him early, I don't expect that to be a serious problem, especially given some of Romero's cardio issues, which he might have really addressed. He didn't seem to fade that much in his last fight, the Costa one. Neither really here nor there necessarily. But so again, there's that. There's the wrestling, which I'm not sure is going to be the biggest factor. Romero is very much a freestyle wrestling guy rather than a folk style, and freestyle wrestling prioritizes getting your opponent down to the mat more so than prolonged contact. Not to say that there isn't any there, but if you watch a folk style wrestling or a collegiate style wrestling match, there's a lot more contact, there's a lot more rides. Again, guys like Khabib and Ben Askren really kind of bring that sensibility into MMA. Freestyle rewards a little bit more the explosion through distance. It values, again, there's no points for riding in freestyle like there can be in folk style. Again, I know folk style has gone through some scoring changes over the last several years, so it's just that kind of prolonged contact is just less of a thing in freestyle. So when you see Romero employ his wrestling, he's extremely good about hitting a trip, hitting a knee pick, hitting at some kind of foot sweep takedown, whatever, however he chooses to get you there. He's very, very good about exploding through, driving your butt to the mat, getting your shoulders down, or getting you to your knees. He's very good about creating that motion. He's less good about keeping you there, especially as that sort of skill set in MMA of being able to regain your feet and forcing separation has elevated. So I do kind of expect Romero to get a takedown of some variety at some point. I'm not sure he's going to be able to impose control situations on Adesanya. And that's not a knock on Romero necessarily. That's not really something he does anyway. The longer this stays in kind of prolonged striking exchanges, the more I favor Adesanya. He's just so good at that. The other thing that needs to kind of be discussed here is, Adesanya's camp. He trains out of City Kickboxing with Eugene Behrman, who has produced now 2 UFC champions. I know Volkanovski isn't exclusive to that gym, but does a lot of training there. In fact, Behrman, is one of his cornermen, one of his coaches. That camp, I think Luke Thomas put it best, so I'm going to quote him. That camp audits your game. They will go through every one of your fights multiple times. They will find everything you do, every habit, every twitch, every tendency, every strength, every weakness. They put you through just on tape, they put you through the most severe auditing process they can to break you down and understand what you're going to do and find ways to combat it, to counter it. I mean, they were able to successfully do that with guys like Robert Whittaker. Hadn't lost at middleweight. Or Max Holloway. Max Holloway's run at featherweight is one of the all-time great featherweight runs. You can argue the greatest. You can argue his run after that bad decision to Tavares. His run up to the belt, his title win, his title defenses. You can argue that's the best featherweight run ever. I might argue Aldo's was better given just sheer longevity. But that's the kind of company we're talking about. With a very nuanced, very modular game, great adaptability. And that team and Volkanovski were able to gain a profound understanding of Max Holloway and beat him comprehensively. I mean, that wasn't a finish, but there was no controversy about the scoring of that fight. I mean, okay, the 50-45 scorecard was a little iffy. But even, I rewatched that fight recently. I can see the 50-45. I think that's what I did live, but, doing it live, I was doing both coverage and alternate commentary with Mark. Myself a little bit of a break there when I turn in a bad scorecard on occasion if I'm doing 3 things. Even if they overlap, it's kind of difficult. So, the point being, I miss stuff when I do it like that. I can see the 50-45. The fourth in particular, I think, probably should have gone Max's way, but it's not like Volkanovski didn't have great moments in that round. He did. So, again, they're willing to, go through that process and just strip your game down and find out everything they can about it. And Romero, while he does have, again, freakish athleticism and the ability to surprise you, especially if you're very analytical, especially if you're very reliant on reads, he's very good about taking that and just, once you get somewhat comfortable, switching things up just enough to catch you by surprise. I mean, that said, I am picking Adesanya fairly. I will not be surprised if Romero wins, but if you're asking me to pick, I pick Adesanya, and I feel pretty good about that. But great, great fight. Hope it holds together. Can't wait for it. Should be a good one. Co-main event, women's strawweight champion Zhang Weili will be defending against Zhang Weili. God, I suck. Will be defending against former champion Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I've had a hard time kind of getting my head around this fight. And there's a pretty specific reason for that, actually, and it has to do with Zhang. First of all, Zhang's on a 20-fight winning streak. Her only loss was her professional debut. Like, that's pretty impressive, however you slice it. She's been posting a lot of some of her training videos, and the woman hits very, very... I mean, she stopped Jessica Andrade clean. She hits hard. But if you look at her UFC fights, so let's go down these very briefly. Danielle Taylor. There was a lot of both of them just circling, low-line side kicks. There wasn't a lot to show. Jessica Aguilar. She gets an armbar submission in the first round, only about 340. She looked to be better on the feet, but there was, again, a lot of that circling, some kicks, and then Aguilar forces the grappling. Zhang comes out on top of it, so, fair play, showing that you have that kind of grappling ability is a very beneficial thing. Then she fights Tecia Torres, and it's a lot of the same kind of stuff you got in the Danielle Taylor fight. You're just not seeing a tremendous amount of her game in those fights. And then, of course, Andrade runs into some counter punches, gets kneed in the head, falls over at 42 seconds. I'm just not sure how she is going to match up with a point fighter, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, in Joanna. Joanna's really, really good at winning rounds. That's a hard thing to do, and she's good at it. She's going to be fighting, someone who likes fighting longer, who's good about chopping at your legs and scoring. If you're, the one coming at her, she's more comfortable, actually, at this point in her career absorbing pressure than going forward. I'm certainly not going to pretend that Zhang can't win this fight. She not only hits very hard, she's very well schooled, but we've never seen her have to fight at a high pace for a long period of time. We've never seen her out of the third round, I think, in her entire career. Yeah, she's never gone out of the third round. And we're seeing her against someone who's going to kind of make her fight awkwardly. So, if Zhang can kind of get Joanna to be the one pressing forward, set some traps, kind of bait her into stuff, and then move quickly through distance, I think that's her best bet, but that's not really a skill set she's shown off a whole lot. She's going to be shorter. In reach, certainly. I think in height she's shorter. Confirm that. Zhang is 5'4". Officially, Joanna is 5'6", so only 2 inches, actually, in height. About reach. Joanna's reach is 65.5 inches. Zhang's is 63, so she's 2 inches shorter, 2 inches of reach in the arms. Probably a little bit longer in the legs. And Joanna's good about kicking at long distance. Zhang's going to want this in closer quarters. Joanna has struggled a bit in the pocket recently. If you watch her first few UFC fights, Joanna's game revolves a lot more around her jab or on boxing range. Over the last few years, she's switched that to be more kick-centric. A lot more chopping with the legs. And, I mean, again, in fairness, it's a strategic decision. It's worked for her. I mean, her only losses ever are, the 2 to Rose, which is just a nightmare for her stylistically. After, Rose with the ability to just kind of leap in and close distance, and then the rematch showed that's kind of how that fight goes. And then to Valentina Shevchenko, up at flyweight, and Shevchenko is just, I wouldn't say completely unbeatable, but an extraordinarily difficult woman to defeat in combat sports. So I'm really torn on this one, and I don't even really have much of an analog, for okay, who was the last the last power striker that Joanna fought was probably Andrade, but I don't think that's an appropriate comparison given that Zhang doesn't move or fight like Andrade. Andrade is a forward moving tank, and Joanna just constantly played Matador. Just move back, jab, move back, 1-2, kick, slip, repeat, just picked her apart. I don't think Zhang is going to be that relentlessly one note with her pressure. The power striking is a big deal, but part of the reason Rose was very successful was, first of all, she didn't bite on any of Joanna's fakes or feints, and then Rose's length, I think, gave Joanna's reads some real problems. She never got a great feel for the distance that Rose was going to be operating at. And I don't know that, again, there's so much about Zhang that we haven't seen at this level. So I don't really know. I don't pick against Joanna very often. I mean, I did for the Shevchenko fight, and I think I did for the Rose rematch, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Again, this is a tough fight on paper right now because the other thing about Joanna is worth noting. She's been fighting for a very long time. And, I mean, she's been, her kickboxing and Muay Thai career and whatnot dates back to, the early 2000s, I think. So, closer to 20 years fighting than not. I think like 2008 or so is some of the first titles she started winning in kickboxing. So 12 years. Let's just go with 12. Feels like a pretty safe number. And again, probably a little bit earlier than that, but let's just say 12. So she's been fighting for about 12 years. If you look at her last... Okay, let's go back to her title win in 15. That was the second round stoppage. Jessica Penne, second round stoppage. Valerie Letourneau, decision, 5 rounds. Gadelia rematch, decision, 5 rounds. Carolina, 5 rounds. Andrade, 5 rounds. Rose the first time, stopped in the first. Rose the second time, 5-round loss. Tisha Torres, 3-round win. Shevchenko, 5-round loss. Michelle Waterson, 5-round win. For someone 12 years into their career, give or take, that's a lot of in-cage time that she's racked up since 15. So over that 5-year period, give or take, that's a lot of rounds. That's a lot of rounds. It's a lot of wear and tear. And a lot of that at a very, very high level. Again, Zhang's been fighting in mixed martial arts since 13. So 7 years. And she had a few kickboxing fights. But anyway, so looking purely at her MMA career, 7 years, give or take. And she's just a little over 6 now because she debuted in November of 13. And a lot of she's only been to the 3rd round twice. I mean, she's been wrecking people by and large. There's probably... So, I don't know. I do wonder if Joanna's becoming a little bit just kind of worn down after all those years and all those fights. And some of those fights that she's had in the UFC have been pretty grueling affairs. I feel like I'm trying to talk myself out of picking Joanna because I kind of just slapdash on paper want to go, yeah, I think she's going to lead Zhang around the ring, around the cage, counter strike her, pick her apart, chew her up. Yeah, alright, I'm going to pick Joanna, but I do not feel very confident in that at all. Okay, moving on. Lightweight, Beneil Dariush and Drakkar Klose. Good fight. Dariush is a fairly underappreciated lightweight. Currently on a 3-fight winning streak. Which he needed after, he had a rough stretch there, man. Where he had a great 2.5 rounds against Barboza before getting flying kneed. Had a draw against Evan Dunham he was kind of fortunate to get. And then got blitzed by Alexander Hernandez. But he seems to be a little bit back on track. With Klose, we have a guy with only one loss ever, professionally. Also on a 3-fight winning streak, good wrestler. I'm leaning a little bit towards Dariush, but Dariush might be fading. And lightweight is an incredibly unforgiving division. At welterweight, Neil Magny is back. No one cares, but I joke about Magny. He's been on the shelf for a while due to a drug test issue. He was last scheduled to fight in May of last year. That got pulled. He's fighting Li Jingliang. Li's on a 3-fight winning streak. He's rather impressively actually 7-3 in his last 7-1, 7-1 in his last 8. I kind of like Li here actually. I mean, I'm a believer in Magny's general ability. But he hasn't fought since November of 18 when he was starched by Ponzinibbio. I'm kind of leaning towards Li here. The layoff's a bit of an issue. I mean, that said, Magny could very easily come in, get the clinch, get him down, do Magny things. So I'm kind of pulling for Magny to, come back and make a good, have a good performance here. But I'm gonna lean towards Li officially. And in on some guaranteed chaos, because we have the dirtiest fighter in the UFC, Alex Oliveira, on a 3-fight losing streak, taking on Max Griffin, who's another bit of, he's not as dirty, but he's another bit of chaos. Griffin has a pretty terrible UFC record, actually, of 3-5. To be fair, I thought he won the Thiago Alves fight. But yeah, he's had a very, very up and down UFC run. Alex Oliveira, rugged, again, a little bit dirty. I'm going to go with Alex Oliveira here, but that's just because Griffin is so wildly inconsistent. As for the prelims, Sean O'Malley is finally back against Jose Alberto Quinones. Quinones, only loss in the UFC, he's had 2. So he lost to Alejandro Perez in his UFC debut. 4-fight winning streak, lost to Nathaniel Wood, bounced back with the win over Carlos Huachin. O'Malley, undefeated, hasn't fought since March of 18, so just about 2 years. Logically, I'm going to go with O'Malley, but I have never been as impressed with O'Malley as others. And I'm just going to kind of go with, there's people who know more about this than I do who have said this guy's really good. That I'm going to, his performance actually at the, I think there was a quintet event, some submission grappling event, where he really, really overperformed. And had a really good showing, actually, against some decorated grapplers. That did more for my perspective and opinion on his abilities than his UFC fights, actually. So, gonna go with O'Malley there, but potentially a good fight. Mark Madsen will fight Austin Hubbard. This was supposed to be... Nope, so this was always this fight. Mark Madsen had a good UFC debut. He's an Olympian. He won what? Silver? Yeah, he's an Olympic silver medalist and a 4-time overall medalist at the World Wrestling Championships. He's a really, really decorated amateur wrestler. Yeah, he won silver in Rio, actually. Had a successful UFC debut. Now he is fighting Austin Hubbard. I don't think of this as a gimme, but the UFC is also kind of taking a bit of their time with Madsen, I think. So I expect him to win here. Middleweight Rodolfo Vieira is back against... Would that be Vieira? I don't know. I've heard a few conflicting things about how the R's work in Portuguese a little bit, so I'm going to go with Vieira at the moment, but if I'm wrong, my apologies. Rodolfo Vieira and Saparbek Safarov. I believe this is Safarov's first trip to middleweight. He just broke a 2-fight losing streak recently when he beat vastly over... I shouldn't say over, like out of his depth, Nikolai Negumereanu. I expect Vieira to win this. I expect Rodolfo Vieira to win this. Another middleweight fight, Gerald Meerschaert and Deron Winn. This is a good fight. Meerschaert, just kind of a tough veteran. Really kind of a sneaky grappler. Deron Winn coming off of the first loss of his career. I feel like Deron Winn should take this one, but it's not an easy fight, put it like that. Then on the early prelims, Emily Whitmire will fight Poliana Viana. Viana has a grand total of a record of 1-3 in the UFC, whereas Whitmire has gone back and forth. I think she's 2-2. Probably go with Whitmire here, but again, that's iffy. Either of them could pull that out. And then we have Dana Batgaril versus Guido Canetti. You know, that one's got some potential, actually. Canetti has been trading wins and losses in the UFC. He's 2-3. Some of those losses were tough losses. You know, the Kyung Ho Kong one, Henry Briones, Marlon Vera. Kong and Vera in particular are, I wouldn't say like elite level guys, but they're definitely top notch. Batgarel had a tough outing in his UFC debut. He lost, but again, turned in a really fun performance. So, there's some potential there. I shouldn't pick Batgarel, but I'm going to, because, I don't know, I feel like taking a flyer on that with a prediction. Anyway, that is the current setup for UFC 248. Really good card, actually, top to bottom. There's not a lot of stuff on paper there that's a dud. In practice, who knows? But really, really solid card. Really looking forward to it this Saturday. You can find me covering this in the MMA Zone of 411mania.com, so please stop by. Please say hello. Leave a comment if you're so inclined. If not, share it on Twitter, Facebook, if you like it. Much like with this podcast. If you're watching, listening, reading, and you enjoy what I do, please tell people. Share it on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever you do. I don't know, whatever other platforms you choose to share. Get on top of your roof with a bullhorn. I mean, don't do that if it's illegal, but you know what I mean. Let people know about what's going on. I really, really do appreciate it. Because I know I don't have the biggest audience in the world, but I like you guys, and I am trying to grow that into... I'd like to grow it. I like for the growth to be upward, not negative. So, please, if you want to support my work here on this podcast or my writing, tell people about it. Best thing you can do. Well, if you're on the podcast side of things, you can also subscribe, whatever your podcast platform of choice is. Stitcher, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, whatever. If you can subscribe there, interact with that a little bit. That will help tremendously, as well as sharing it. If we're talking about the live coverage, that's what I got. Share it. Tell people about it, please. I occasionally wonder if I'm the only thing holding the MMA Zone up. I mean, I'm not the editor for it, but, content for that particular zone is not being churned out a lot lately, and I always kind of wonder. So if you would please just share it around, always appreciated. I deeply appreciate all of you guys. I really, really do. I know there's not a lot of you, but hopefully there will be more in the future. All right, schmoozing out of the way. Let's move on to some news. The UFC announced officially for UFC 250, Henry Cejudo defending the bantamweight title against Jose Aldo. I hate this fight. Here's the thing about this fight, especially relative to the one we just talked about, Adesanya and Romero. If you look at Adesanya and Romero, and we went over it, there's not really another option here. Like, Romero is genuinely the best option for the middleweight title, and considering that the middleweight title is the only title really available for this pay-per-view, that's where things are. By contrast, let's look at bantamweight, shall we? Who are the top contenders at bantamweight? The top 3 guys, in my opinion, 4 actually, the 4 contenders, and I'm not going to rank these in order that the UFC has them, but in order of who probably should be getting the title shot. Aljamain Sterling, Peter Yan, Corey Sandhagen, Marlon Moraes. So we have 4 guys, top shelf contenders. Aljamain Sterling on a really long run. I know there's not a lot of hype behind him, but that's not all there is to this. You do have to preserve the architecture of winning matters, or you risk tremendously upsetting the machinery that you've got going, and I don't think you want to see what that's like when that breaks down, really. So you've got Sterling, who you're giving the finger to. If you want to go by hype, then there's Peter Yan, who is not only undefeated in the UFC, only has 1 loss ever that he avenged, just on one of the bigger pay-per-views of last year, abused and then finished Uriah Faber with a head kick. So you got that. You got Corey Sandhagen, who was deprived of an opportunity for a big career win when Frankie Edgar moved up. Stepped in on somewhat short notice to fight Korean Zombie and then got knocked out. But Sandhagen definitely someone in that discussion. And then Marlon Moraes. I put Marlon lowest, not because he is least deserving in some kind of objective sense, or the worst of that group, but he just fought Henry Cejudo not that long ago and got finished without a lot of controversy in the 3rd round. I mean, that said, he, tore the crap out of Cejudo's legs and body with kicks in the 1st round. And then just Cejudo adjusted. And credit to him for it. So I put him there not because, again, he is the worst fighter of that group, but I think he's the hardest sell. Despite the fact that he just beat Jose Aldo, who is getting this shot. So you are actively going over 3 to 4 deserving contenders here. And I don't like that at all. Again, look at middleweight. If it's not Romero, who's available? There's not really anyone else available. If it's not Aldo, who's available? Well, Sterling, Yan, Sandhagen, Moraes. They're all available. I don't think any of them are out or injured. They're all free. They're all ready to fight. But here's where a bit more of kind of the machinery comes in. UFC 250 is taking place in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The UFC naturally wants a Brazilian attraction in the main event. And Aldo's kind of all they've got. The next generation of Brazilian talents has not really arrived. If we're talking about guys who, really kind of capture the fan base, succeed at a high level, there hasn't really been anyone since, Shogun and the Nogueiras and Machida and Vanderlei. Like, that old guard, they had their time. It went away, like it does. But if you look at, the next kind of wave of Brazilian guys, in the UFC, it hasn't been there. Paulo Costa is the closest thing you've got. You don't... I mean, look, Marlon Moraes is Brazilian, but doesn't really have, a big following in Brazil. If you're going to host an event in Brazil, you put Jose Aldo's name on a poster, you put Marlon Moraes' name on a poster, which of those two is going to draw? The answer is Aldo. I mean, part of that is Aldo still lives in Rio, I think. He still trains there, I believe. Whereas Moraes, I think he lives and trains in New Jersey now. He's, part of the Mark Henry's group. And you want someone local, and you're going to have Amanda Nunes on this card. Not trying to undersell that. But I'm not sure how Nunes' star power is in Brazil. Might be good. Might be really, really good. I don't know. But Nunes has only, I think, headlined the one pay-per-view, and she kind of got that headlining spot more because of Ronda Rousey's star power than her own. So it seems unlikely you were going to, main event. And, let's also be clear, 250 is one of those big numbers. We kind of like stuff that ends in 5, stuff that ends in 0, and 250, congratulations, you're a quarter of the way to 1,000. They're going to try to put some effort into this card, in theory. So you want the double titles, and Aldo is, kind of the last Brazilian star that's still able to fight at a high level. I mean, the loss to Moraes was a very competitive fight. I scored it for Moraes, but if you scored for Aldo, hey, more power to you. I can't argue. I can tell you why I think Moraes won. I can't necessarily tell you why I think Jose Aldo lost. And, I mean, his only loss at featherweight prior to that were, McGregor, Holloway, and Volkanovski. Like, Jose Aldo is still really good. And has a fairly legitimate shot at winning this fight. I mean, again, much as I hate it from a structural standpoint, how do I say this? Jose Aldo is probably the best anti-wrestler the sport has seen. I mean, this is a guy without a wrestling background who, just through repetition of stop the takedown, stop the takedown, stop the takedown, stop different kinds of takedowns, if your butt does hit the canvas, bounce back up, wall walk immediately. Like, I'd be really hard-pressed to find anyone who, from a technical perspective, is a better counter/anti-wrestler than Jose Aldo, ever. And part of that's because a lot of guys were trying to take him down. A lot of very, very talented guys were trying to take him down. And just had no success. So, if Henry... Now, to be fair, level of grappling and takedowns presented by Chad Mendes. Not really the same level of wrestling that Olympic gold medalist Henry Cejudo brings. Okay, I'm willing to absolutely stipulate Cejudo is the best wrestler he's ever faced. But unless that level of difference proves to be a serious problem for Jose Aldo, I mean, think about it this way. What if Cejudo can't get Jose Aldo down at all? Just think about it for a second. Now, Cejudo has some skills on the feet. He's been doing a little bit of the, kind of the karate-style stance. He's got some power in his hands. He's not bad in the pocket. But if we're talking about an MMA fight that is contested almost entirely on the feet or in the clinch, who do you favor? You favor Henry Cejudo or Jose Aldo? Now let's take that and put it at, let's, say it takes place entirely at the end of Jose Aldo's reach, where his jab and his kicking game can kind of tear you up. Jose Aldo can absolutely win this fight. I don't know that I'm going to pick him, but if Cejudo's wrestling is nullified, and maybe that doesn't happen, but if what we know about Aldo's anti and counter wrestling holds up against the level of wrestling that Cejudo brings, purely on the feet, I am not a big fan of Cejudo's chances against Jose Aldo. Just throwing that out there. That said, if Aldo does pull that off, give me Jose Aldo and Peter Yan. Oh, God, give me that fight. Give me those two maniacs of violence and technique throwing what they've got at each other for 5 rounds. I need that. Just hook that into my veins. So, again, don't like Cejudo Aldo for all those reasons. But I'm not gonna put my head in the sand and pretend I don't understand how we got here. Let's see. This was a real minor news story, but it amuses me, so I'm going to talk about it. There was a fight between Tito Ortiz and former WWE. I shouldn't only pigeonhole Alberto Del Rio, Alberto Del Patron, Dos Caras Jr., whatever you want to call him. I shouldn't fully pigeonhole him as former WWE guy, because, well, he is that. He also wrestled at the Pan American Games. He had some MMA fights. He somewhat hilariously got head kicked by Mirko Krokop at Pride. He fought wearing the mask because he was Dos Caras Jr. at the time and didn't want to reveal his identity, and Pride was go along with wacky stuff. So he's trying to fight Krokop in his prime, wearing this mask. Oh, God. Krokop head kicked him into oblivion. Point being, the man has this isn't a CM Punk thing, where, Punk, God bless him for trying, I suppose, zero competitive athletic background. Zero. Del Rio has a legitimate competitively athletic background. So he and Tito Ortiz had a fight. Tito wins. Submission in the first. Nothing. This took place for the Combate Americas, I believe. Nothing terribly controversial here. For a brief period of time over the last week, the result was changed to a no contest. Turns out there was a minor issue with one of Tito's drug tests. Tito's claim was that the issue in question was a medication prescribed by his physician, and apparently it's one of those things where if it's prescribed, there's not an issue, I guess. So they just changed the result while they investigated, while they confirmed Tito's side of things. Tito's doctor confirmed it. However much credence you want to give all of this, I tend to go along with it. And the result was reinstated. I'm not sure why any of that was public. I mean, sure, you get a guy that you have a discrepancy with the drug test, but if you're going to go through the effort of double checking the story and whatnot, I don't know why you had to make that public. I mean, I'm all for transparency in a lot of respects, but I don't know why this was as public as it was. Let me just put it like that. That event took place in Texas, and the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs is a clown fiesta. I don't know what else to tell you. Okay, I think that's everything, actually, so let me refresh Twitter. See if anything crazy has come up. Okay, I'm going to quote this because this is amusing. Yoel Romero's just kind of doing some media rounds, for the fight coming up. Apparently, he wants to fight for another decade. He's 42 officially, allegedly. Again, there's some record-keeping issues with Cuba, so who knows how old he actually is, a little bit. But he says he wants to fight until he's 52 and surpass the record of Bernard Hopkins, who boxed until he was 51. Can we just talk for just a second about the athletic and genetic freak that is Yoel Romero? I mean, there's a quote from Ben Folks here. He's 2 years younger than Yoel Romero, so 40. And he says his current goal is to get to a place where he no longer hurts himself if he has to sleep with a different pillow than his usual one. Yoel Romero out here at 42, looking like he's sculpted out of marble, saying he wants to fight competitively for another decade. They broke the mold when they made that, man. Because if there's 20 Yoel Romeros walking around, that 20 Yoel Romeros could take over a small city. Okay, that little bit of silliness aside. See if anything else broke. I don't think anything else crazy has happened. Yeah, alright, I think it's gonna be that. We'll go ahead and get into plugs for myself, such as they are. Okay, you can find me this Tuesday on Damn You Hollywood over in the Radulich and Broadcasting Network / W2M Network. We will be reviewing the #1 movie in the country right now, The Invisible Man. This would be Lee Winnell's adaptation of the original. At the moment, it seems to be doing not just well financially, but critics seem to like it. I'm still dubious. But I generally like Winnell as a director. And I'm prepared to be wrong. I don't necessarily expect it. Look, there's a real chance that coming out of this movie I go, all these critics are idiots and here's why. Which I have done in the past. Probably will do in the future, too. But so you can find a review of that. Next week will be Onward. So look forward to those. If you like my movie reviews, feel free to, continue. Like, I appreciate you guys listening to those, too. Make sure you check out I'll pimp Jeff's stuff in absentia. Make sure you check out his reviews of, I think he has an Onward review that's up right now. So be sure to check out his stuff, as well as all the podcasts here on the 411 Podcasting Network. The 4-1 on Wrestling with Larry Zonka, Jeff Harris's interview podcast series, and thank you for listening to this one. And what did I do last week? Last week, if you still like other stuff that I do, there was the TV party for the Netflix Lock and Key adaptation, where I got to be very, very sad. So you can listen to that. The source material for Lock and Key that I did with Alexis Haina and Jesse Starcher over on the Source Material podcast dropped. So listen to those if you want to hear my thoughts on stuff other than MMA. MMA takes up a lot of my time and attention, but not 100% of it. So thanks for that. Again, UFC 248 this Saturday. Very much looking forward to that. And back here next week with a review of 248, and we will be previewing UFC on ESPN Plus 28. The UFC is in Brasilia, Brazil. And the main event is Kevin Lee and Charles Oliveira. That's a good fight. Damian Maia and Gilbert Burns in your co-main event, that's a good fight. Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos and Alexei Kunchenko is a good fight. Renato Moicano and Damir Hadzovic is pretty good. Johnny Walker and Nikita Krylov, it's slightly upper-level light heavyweights. Jussier Formiga. That card is actually not bad. It's not going to jump off the page at anyone if you're not like me. But if you're kind of in the weeds, so to speak, in the MMA scene, that's a pretty decent card on paper. So we'll get a full preview of that for you guys next week. Until then, thank you all again very much for listening, for subscribing, for commenting if you can, for giving us reviews. I always appreciate all of that. I know everyone else does. Thank you very much. I will see you all next week. Stay safe out there, and please continue to be well, be safe, and behave.